So I get the pleasure to introduce Beth Sondel as assistant professor at North Carolina State University. Her research partners critical theory with qualitative research to interrogate the potential for public schools to perpetuate and/or interrupt social inequalities. More specifically, Sondel looks at the effects of privatization and market-based reform on the social justice and democratic purposes of schooling. Recently, she has addressed these issues through qualitative case studies and critical policy network analysis of Teach for America's role in promoting and implementing market-based reform in New Orleans and elsewhere. Sondel received her PhD in Curriculum and Instruction, Curriculum Theory and Design from the University of Wisconsin, a Master's of Education in Educational Policy and Management Studies from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and a Bachelor of Arts in Cultural Anthropology from the University of Wisconsin. So, welcome, Beth.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. It feels like a great honor as a junior faculty to be in conversations like these. So much of what I'm going to talk about today is really building on the conversations that Tina started for us and also other things that we've been talking about in the sessions and over lunch. In terms of an introduction, I too entered the field of education through Teach for America. So for full disclosure, my research, the personal became political and then became my research. And also similar to Tina, it was in graduate school in around 2008, 2009 when I started to realize the relationship between Teach for America and market-based reform, that my research interest started to solidify around that particular organization. My research is primarily qualitative, and I'm mostly interested in what happens with market-based reforms in classrooms between teachers and students. But while doing that work on the side, I met two colleagues, Carrie Kretschmar at Carroll University and Joe Farrar at the University of Kentucky, and together we've started to use social policy network analysis to look at Teach for America and their relationship with market-based reform. So the project that I'm going to talk to you about today is one that I've been working on with Carrie and Joe for the past couple of years. We started looking at TFA and charter schools, and now we're looking specifically at TFA and their impact on the deregulation of teacher education. So in this project and in this paper, we're really trying to look at how does TFA influence policies around teacher education. So in terms of the socio-political context around Teach for America's relationship with teacher education, we have, and we've been talking about this now, what I consider a manufactured crisis in teacher education. So much like we've seen in K through 12 schools, while there clearly was never a golden era of teacher ed, we've never completely figured out how to prepare enough teachers and prepare all teachers to be effective. In the past couple of years, we're seeing a ramping up of critique of teacher education, and this here is from the Obama administration's website release of their new regulations on teacher education, and they say, far too many of the programs that prepare our teachers are inadequate. Improving these programs is essential to ensuring our nation's students receive the education that they deserve. And so within this crisis that we see in teacher education, and again, for what it's worth, I'm not saying that in teacher ed we have everything figured out at all, but I think there's a lot of attention to the shortcomings right now. And as a result, we see an increase of accountability with EdTPA. We see a push for value-added data systems like the Obama administration's new regulations, and we see what Ken Zeichner calls this hyper-rationality, where people working in teacher ed programs are really forced to document so much of what they're doing to prove that what they're doing is effective, that it takes away from the actual work of preparing pre-service teachers. At the same time, as we see an increase in accountability, we also see a decrease in funding of teacher ed programs, and we all know this, that public universities consistently face falling budgets, and a lot of times schools of ed are particularly vulnerable to that. And we also see schools of ed being denied federal grants. So in 2010, in the Investing in Innovation grants, none of the proposals submitted by public universities were funded, yet a number of alternative credentialing programs were offered a significant amount of money, and I'll talk about that shortly. And then also we see this decrease in perceived value of teacher ed programs. So these two here, Walker and Jindal, both at different times have questioned the value of teacher education programs at all, suggesting that, you know, a college degree and an assessment should legitimize someone to step into a classroom. So this environment, we are arguing, has set the stage and opened the space for alternative programs, specifically Teach for America as the most well-known, most highly funded alternative credentialing program. So I think we all are aware here of what Teach for America is, but every year they train college graduates, the vast majority of whom have not studied education, to receive 5 weeks of training before being put in classrooms as teachers of record for 2 years. What's interesting to me is that TFA's recruitment is down 25% this year, and I don't know this empirically, only anecdotally, but all of my students in my teacher ed program now are being recruited by Teach for America. And so while historically they have targeted people outside of schools of education, it's worth investigating whether now that their enrollment is down, and also how they're gonna account for the actual teacher training program that their core members go through when they're in their TFA placements. And as Tina discussed earlier, TFA has received significant funding from both venture philanthropists and the federal government. So in a really interesting article by Reckhow and Snyder, these two scholars trace the top 15 venture philanthropists funding that they offer to organizations over the past 20 years. And what they find is that historically, philanthropists gave small buckets of money to lots of different organizations, and now we increasingly see philanthropists all targeting their money towards the same organizations, and all of these organizations tend to have a market-based focus or some sort of idea around working outside of public institutions. And of all of the organizations that receive philanthropic funding, TFA has the highest rate of convergence, meaning that 10 of the top 15 philanthropists who give to education are giving a total of, just in 2010, $44.5 million to TFA. And then in addition, the organization has gotten a significant amount of money from the federal government. So the Innovation in Education grant that I mentioned earlier gave $50 million to TFA. So the money that organization is using, much of it is coming from the federal government. TFA places somewhere around 11,000 teachers a year, which is less than 0.2% of teachers in the country, but as Tina got us started saying, their impact extends far beyond their classroom walls. And in this paper, we're talking about how this impact specifically affects university-based teacher education. And from their beginning, Teach for America has had two distinct missions. The first being to prepare teachers to fill a national teaching shortage. And although since the recession, there is no longer a teaching shortage in many districts where TFA used to place. And so now they've kind of shifted their rhetoric to say they will now provide high quality teachers to low-income districts. And this is, I think, why we see so much quantitative research about their program, is because they really need to prove their effectiveness to maintain the demand for their programs. And the second half of TFA's mission has always been to, in their own terms, develop a movement to close the national growing achievement gap. And I want to talk about these two missions separately and the ways in which they are influencing teacher education. So in terms of preparing and placing teachers, and I will just speak briefly about this, but as I mentioned, TFA started to say that they would teach, they didn't want to compete with teacher ed programs, they wanted to fill a shortage where teachers were not going, but now their placements are not limited to shortage districts or positions, and in some instances, core members displace more experienced teachers and are privileged in hiring practices. So in a project that Jameson is leading and I'm participating in, we're looking at the ways in which TFA core members are being privileged, looking at memorandums of understandings between districts and TFA, and looking at how TFA is being privileged in the hiring process. And then in addition, and we've talked about this a little bit, there is a lot of research looking at the effectiveness of TFA teachers. And when you look across the large body of research, it's really a complicated picture. And the degree of effectiveness of TFA teachers is really variable based on with whom you're comparing TFA teachers. So their students tend to perform a lot better than students of other alternative credentialing programs, but not so much for university-based teachers. The reason that I mention this is that despite the complicated nature of the research on TFA, they tend to paint a very different picture. So for example, last month, Mathematica released a study in which they said, and it's in purple up there, in all cases, the differences in the effectiveness of TFA and comparison teachers were small and not statistically significant. And then the following day on TFA's Twitter account, this was the picture that they posted, saying, a new study shows that our core members are making a positive impact in the classroom, and then they blew up those bar graphs to make it look like there was a big difference, right? And so I think that alone really shifts the power of teacher education programs. David Lavery wrote this great piece in 2010 about how it's called Heads They Win, Tails We Lose. And he talks about how Teach for America provides college grads an opportunity to do good and do well that teacher ed programs can't do. So you can do good, meaning you're gonna go and serve these kids in this volunteer type of program that's not at all a volunteer program because there's a lot of financial incentive to it. But also the TFA core members can do well and secure their status in society. It's a resume builder. There's a huge network of opportunities. And now I think that TFA is trying to suggest that if by doing their program, you not only do good and do well, but you also do better than those graduating from teacher ed programs. And then the second piece of their mission in the ways in which it's affecting teacher education. So I think Tina talked us through this pretty well. But TFA is on their website. They say they're growing the movement of leaders who work to ensure that kids growing up in poverty get an excellent education. And they do this in multiple ways. They have these alumni social networking with big budgets to connect their alumni. Like Tina, I too get emails pretty regularly recruiting me to participate in leadership development programs. They also have formal partnerships with lots of organizations, educational organizations, graduate schools, and businesses. So for example, New Leaders for New Schools targets Teach for America alumni to participate in their programs to become principals. Graduate programs, for example, Duke, which is in the town that I live in, guarantees a minimum of $14,000 in tuition to TFA alumni that go to their School of Public Policy. So there's a lot of public policy graduate programs that hold spots for TFA alumni or provide additional incentive for TFA to come there to become policymakers. And then, which I'll return to shortly, TFA also has leadership development programs specifically targeted towards developing policymakers. And as Tina and Janelle are looking at in the research, and a couple other folks are as well, TFA alumni tend to describe educational inequity in managerial terms and look to market-based solutions. And we clearly need a richer understanding of that. So what Carrie and Joe and I are working on is really tracing out, using policy network analysis, the networks of power that Teach for America is participating in and helping to develop. So the idea of policy network analysis, the assumption is that there has been a shift in governance away from elected hierarchical systems towards networks of resources, expertise, and reputation. And our work is really inspired by the work of Stephen Ball in the UK, who argues that to understand how and by whom governance happens, the first thing we need to do is trace out the connections between those individuals and organizations who have political power. So to do this, we identified organizations that are connected to TFA, that are specifically working towards influencing the way that we prepare future teachers. And I want to just mention that the data set that we're using is limited by what is available online in an organizational official literature. So most of the information that we're gathering about the people in these positions of power and the organization's formal partnerships with Teach for America are from the organizational websites and the official literature of the organization, as well as from Teach for America's alumni network website that holds a database of where their alumni currently work. I won't get into this, but I just want to put it up here. This is the previous study that we did looking at Teach for America and their relationship to those who are expanding charter school reform. But I do want to talk about this, and it's really small and hard to read. I should have made a handout, but I'll try to explain it to you. So in the center here is Teach for America, obviously, and then around the outer rim of this circle are all organizations that we're making the case are influencing teacher education, and the line, both the shape and the color of the line, denote how they're related to Teach for America. So whether they were founded by TFA alumni, whether they're heavily staffed in leadership positions by TFA, or whether they're in formal partnership with TFA. And this is in the paper, so. But I do want to hone in just on one example, which we've mentioned a little bit, which is Relay Graduate School of Education, which you'll see up there is connected to TFA. They were founded by TFA alumni. They're in formal partnership with TFA, and much of their leadership are TFA alumni. And they're a really good illustration of how this network serves to shape teacher education. So Relay, and we refer to them as jurisdictional challengers, which is a term that Reckow and Snyder use also to say they're an organization that's existing outside or compete with the public sector institutions. So this image is actually from the collaborative reception of Relay, GSC, and Teach for America at AERA next week. So Relay is an independent master's granting institution that not only prepares teachers like the alternative programs that we've seen, but also provides teachers with formal credentials and master's degrees. It works entirely outside of the university setting. It's really a charter teacher preparation program. And it was created as a joint effort between 3 CMOs and TFA. They currently have 5 programs in New York, Houston, Chicago, New Orleans, and Newark, with plans to expand. And they require their teachers, the pre-service teachers in their program, to prove that their students are performing at 70% mastery on state and Common Core assessments in order to receive their degree with Relay. They're currently very understudied, so even as they're expanding, we know very little about what their programs look like, though there have been 2 articles, one by Ken Zeichner, who really critiques Relay for, I guess, what we would probably imagine, which is a heavily scripted curriculum, test-centric approach to teaching. They're primarily using Doug Lemov Teach Like a Champion techniques to train their teachers. They're also explicit in their mission trying to shift teacher preparation at the national level. So they say on their website, our long-term vision is that we will bring about transformational change across teacher preparation. And they contrast their teachers, who they refer to as exceptional thinkers, with those who are sitting in ivory towers. So this is related to what Suzanne was talking about, just this kind of blatant putting people into 2 camps. You're either with us or against us, you're a former or a defender. Many of their leaders, including their provost, are TFA, and many participating in their program are with TFA. So we've talked about this a bit, but historically, TFA relied on universities to administer the credentials for their teachers. But now with programs like Relay, TFA can operate entirely outside of university settings. And then in Newark, we were speaking about this morning, Cammie Anderson, who is a TFA alumni, is the superintendent of Newark, and just, I think it's this year, instituted the Relay Newark program for effective teachers that now says that Newark teachers can get salary advancement credit for courses that they take at Relay, but not for courses that they take anywhere else. So teachers can take classes at Relay, get master's pay increases, but it's not the same for any university setting. Another thing that we talk about in this paper is the way that TFA is shaping teacher education just in terms of what we refer to as human capital dependence. So all of these charter management organizations up here were either founded by or are led by TFA alumni, and others have written about the ways that charter schools rely on TFA teachers to teach in their schools. Ian was telling me that 90% of TFA teachers in LA, somewhere around that, are in charter schools. And so with the expansion of these charter schools, we see that with TFA, these charter schools can exist entirely outside of teacher ed programs. And as mentioned, some of these charter schools themselves that are connected to TFA are starting their own teacher preparation programs. So for example, Yes Prep has now the Yes Prep Teaching Excellence Program, and Achievement First, KIP, and Uncommon Schools together developed Relay. KIP DC and L. Haynes Charter School have started the Capital Teacher Residency. So these charter schools themselves are finding ways to exist outside of teacher education. And then the last point that we discuss extensively, but I want to flesh it out even more in this paper, is the way that TFA is influencing policy around teacher education. And they're doing this, we argue, in 4 specific ways. So the first is by training and supporting alumni as policymakers. So the Capitol Hills Fellow Program, which I believe is very new, was developed for TFA alumni to receive a $60,000 stipend, executive coaching and training, and a 1-year placement with the House, Senate, or Congressional Committee who are working on issues related to education. So even as they're training as policymakers, they also have this direct inroad to the ways that policies are being made. And I think we need to look at this more closely, because you wonder if these folks did 2 years of teaching and did not come through a teacher ed program, and then they are the ones seen with some educational experience working with these House and Senate committee members. What message are they giving about the value of teacher education? And then, of course, there's Leadership for Educational Equity that a number of people have talked about, which is essentially a PAC. It's a nonpartisan organization that trains TFA core members to grow as political leaders. And at least on their website, they claim that they have trained 170 policy, advocacy, and organizational leaders. And in addition to developing policymakers, TFA does direct lobbying. So in 2012, on their 990 reports, they claim that they spent $555,000 specifically on lobbying efforts. And some of what they're lobbying for have direct effects on teacher education. For example, the highly qualified teacher provision, which we're all aware changed the guidelines of NCLB to claim that anyone working towards a credential could qualify as a highly qualified teacher. Well, Kevin Huffman, working with TFA, spent a good deal of time lobbying for that particular provision. There's also, and this didn't end up going through, but Julian Healy Vasquez was just writing about this on his blog last week, that TFA was lobbying in Texas for a bill that would redefine teacher retention so that those who finished a 2-year alternative program, a 2-year commitment, if they stopped teaching after those 2 years, it would not be considered in the attrition rates, because they didn't stop teaching, they just stopped their program. It did not go through though, so. And then in addition, TFA issues statements of support that challenge teacher education. So they have signed their name in support of the GREAT Act, which would increase charter principal programs like Relay and Obama's administration teacher preparation regulations. And then finally, TFA really shifts the public discourse about what it takes to be a teacher first, and just the amount of attention that they brought to themselves and their claim that 5 weeks is enough to prepare for a 2-year experience rather than a career. But in addition, NCTQ, which has done quite a bit to shape public discourse on teacher education as of late. 3 of their leadership staff, including the vice president of NCTQ, are TFA alumni, and the advisory board includes Wendy Kopp, who is the founder of TFA, and TFA alumni and State Senator Michael Johnston. So I think we're trying to the main purpose of this paper is really just to trace out some of the ways that TFA serves as an incubator for leadership, and as a central node in a vast network that's shaping teacher education. And just by creating these network maps, we're showing how TFA alumni are connecting organizations that may be potentially working towards similar ends. Something that I'm interested in exploring potentially for this paper is the way that this looks specifically in North Carolina, where there is a legitimate teaching shortage in the rural districts. And this network analysis leads me to believe that even in the rare case that TFA, the rare case like in rural North Carolina, where TFA is filling a teaching shortage, they are simultaneously potentially exacerbating the fact that we have a teacher shortage in the first place by delegitimizing teacher ed programs and potentially deprofessionalizing the career altogether. And then finally, another thing that I'm really interested in, and I don't think that it'll fit into this particular study, but I think it's very much related, is our need for empirical analysis of the ways that pedagogy is being transmitted through these networks. So here you see these networks of organizations that are connected through and with Teach for America, and how are these organizations conceptualizing pedagogy in similar ways? How are they sharing their training materials in ways that actually have effects on kids in classrooms?